from today. I know we've got a very large crowd today. Over 700 people are registered for today's session. So thank you all for taking the time to learn and discuss a bit more about today's topic, which is the psychosocial risks. Today we're going to be looking at not necessarily specific risks, but generally what can we think about as organizations, as leaders, when we lean into dealing with the mental well-being of our teams. What does this mean, particularly in the Australian context? For those of you who may not be familiar, it's become quite a regulated and legislated aspect of the work that we do. So we'll be jumping into that in detail with our guest today, Shirley Kirchner from ELCA, who has worked in this area for many years and has particular expertise. So we'll dive into that in just a few moments. We'll give a few more people a chance to connect. Thank you, everyone. I see people from Dunedin, New Zealand, from Bangalore, India. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. From Melbourne, from Sydney, Adelaide. Hi, Emily from Vietnam and Marie from the Philippines. Thank you for joining us today. We'll just kick off in just another moment or so. Kia ora, Anna from Auckland, Aratoa. Hi, Manju from Hong Kong. Thank you for joining us. Singapore, Sydney. Genjko from Bhutan. I haven't seen an attendee from Bhutan on our webinars before, so you may be the first. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. So a good, diverse audience that we have joining us. So we'll just let a few more people trickle in. As we get settled, make sure you've got a pen and paper to take your notes, a glass of water if you need to, and turn off any distractions. Mute your phone so you can focus on the content and discussion today. As we have a big crowd, the lines are muted, so use that chat function if you have any questions or any insights that you want to share during the discussion. We'll be starting off with just a bit of background about the topic, and then most of the session will be Shirley and myself having a discussion with yourselves about aspects of this topic. Alrighty, we are 2 minutes past the hour, so let's dive in. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we present from today. That is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, where Shirley and I are both based. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that welcome to any traditional owners that are with us today. I'll also say a big kia ora to our friends across the Tasman there in New Zealand. And as I said, welcome to all of those across the globe who have joined us today and taking your time out. So let's dive into our content. First, for those who may not be so familiar with NeuroLeadership Institute and what we do, our thing is about making organizations more human through science. So we're research driven. We work with about 80 different labs and universities around the world, looking at what does the neuroscience tell us about how people interact, how people respond to stress and other challenges. We've been doing a lot of research around this area around psychosocial well-being and psychological safety, particularly in recent years. We work with a lot of ASX 200 companies here in Australia and about 61% of that Fortune 100 globally. So that's us, and I'd like to introduce our guest for today, Shirley Kirchner from ELCA, to give us a bit of an introduction about your interesting background and the work that you do. Welcome, Shirley.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's been fabulous having conversations with you, and it's lovely to share that with the hundreds of people on this webinar. So a little bit about me. My background is corporate law, so Allens and Gilbert and Tobin. And interestingly, I became a mediator and then worked with the Harvard Negotiation Program in negotiation training. So people look at my background, because then I started a consultancy working in dispute resolution, and go, what is the unifying factor? And the unifying factor in my background is actually creating safe spaces for people to have difficult conversations. And that is the connecting factor with Elka, because a number of years ago, I thought, can we create that safe space digitally? And so Elka was born. And Elka is really about creating digital spaces where people can report up anonymously, and we'll talk a bit about that later. And it's built on all of my consultancy experience, and it's really about amplifying within organizations transparency, agency, and trust. And we're lucky enough to work with the legal profession, which isn't surprising since that's where I come from, as well as federal, state governments, and some very large businesses, some transport companies, some building companies. So we're industry agnostic. And it's fabulous for me because my undergrad degree is psychology and biology of the brain. So it's a real pleasure for me to be co-presenting with you today. Thank you.
Wonderful. And great to have you. And it's been great sort of coming at this challenge around how we understand psychosocial risk from our different angles,
diverse
angles, but trying to find our way through this topic to that same outcome. So the same outcome that we have, mentally healthy workplaces and teams where we work. So hopefully sort of that's also interesting to participants today. Like I said, ask any questions as we go through the session. As we unpack this, we'll often be talking about legislation and regulations. When we do that, it's primarily around the Australian context. So Shirley will give a bit more of a background that shortly, but we know different jurisdictions are dealing with this challenge of psychosocial risk and psychosocial hazard in different ways. So when we talk about legislation, it's largely from the Australian context in that thing. So again, this is not legal advice. Yes, Shirley is a lawyer. I am not. So this is just general discussion, education about what is happening in the context.
And Jeff, one of the things that was just fabulous for me before I talk about who it applies to is that, when you look at making workplaces psychologically safe or complying with psychosocial risk, that's really a leadership job, not a legal job. And so actually getting me to step back and not put my lawyer hat on and think of it as a manager hat has been, a really fabulous conversation. And the other thing that I think was really interesting when we talked about it was the look on your face when I said to you, this isn't only for employees, don't you? So I think one of the things people often need to think about is how broadly this applies particularly in Australia, but as a leader, how broadly you need to think about it elsewhere. So our code and regulations cover employers, but they also cover outworkers, apprentices, trainees, and volunteers. And it can also cover people in workplaces like customers and visitors. So I think it's really, especially if you're coming in from a not-for-profit, really important, because like some of the not-for-profits like the Smith family and others have hundreds of volunteers. And all of us will often have customers and visitors on site. So that's a really useful thing to
And
think
that's actually something, until we were sort of preparing for the session today, I hadn't really made that connection personally. I've recently been doing a lot of work with an airline in Southeast Asia, helping them improve their customer journey and their culture around customer service. So we've been looking at the customer journey, from check-in and boarding and other touch points, really in the context of how can we reduce a passenger's stress and anxiety as they move through the travel journey from a customer satisfaction lens. So we've been coming at it as how can we make customers happier? And then I had this insight as that, actually, the same applies when we talk about the check-in experience or boarding for someone who might have a problem with crowds or a problem with reading, signage and things like that. So that creates a psychosocial hazard, an issue for them. So let's step back and say, okay, how can we not just improve how our employees are, in those situations, but also think about the broader impact that we can have as organizations, as leaders.
Yeah,
Sure.
and the example, yeah, I was going to say the example is that of an, and I love it when you can talk about leaders doing it well. It just gives me joy. But I work in a kitchen at a church one night a week, and when I was doing my orientation, one of the things that they talked about was psychosocial safety,
Mm.
and they said, look, things go wrong, and we're going to have a lockdown. We're going to have a social worker staying with you, and you need to stay back for 20 minutes afterwards so we can just check in
Mm.
how that impacted you and whether you were okay. And I just went tick in the box in my head.
Yeah.
Here's an organization that knows their volunteers need to be psychologically safe.
Yeah. And there's a question just in the chat from Dan about how might that extend to schools and students. And I don't know whether the legislation, you'd have to get some advice on that if you're working in a school system. But
It certainly applies to the teachers and
yeah,
also to the support people who often are there for, students with neurodiversity. They often take a big load, and now if you're in a school, you're responsible for them. So that's a really good point.
But it's for me, it's sort of, I think it's an opportunity to sit back and say, let's review all of our touch points as an organization. Who do we interact with? Who comes into our workplaces? And look at some of the impacts that might apply to them. So when we talk about the key areas, some of you might be familiar with this if you've been looking closely at the code. There's three big chunks that seems to fit into. Firstly is around that organizational leadership and support. So culture and change management, and how do we operationalize the work that we do. The second big area is about the job itself and the environment that job is done in. So remote and isolated work is always a big one that pops up. Role clarity, job demands, are you giving a fair amount of work to people? And the third big one around workplace interactions and behaviors. And this is something at NLI we often do a lot of work in around, how do you give people the tools and the habits to deal with aggression, to deal with workplace conflict, and psychological safety and inclusion. So in terms of when we think about that impact of the social wellbeing, there's four big areas that it's good to think about. Firstly, that regulatory context, which will vary depending on where you're from. The second big one is the business cost. So what is the cost through attrition, absenteeism, productivity of psychosocial wellbeing on how people actually contribute to the bottom line? The third big one, which we won't talk too much about today, but is employee value proposition. So competitive benchmarking, recruitment, all of those expectations that people have joining companies now. And the third one is around the physical safety, the impact of our mental health on our physical health. So presenteeism, injuries, alcohol and drug use as self-treatment can all be signs that show up in our physical sense, but are often underlying connections to mental health. So just dying and maybe let's sort of have a bit of a two-way on these couple of slides, Shirley. So firstly, there's the business cost, which we talked about before. Some of the there's been some research around this looking at those organizations that really support the well-being of their teams see a 25% decrease in sick leave and a 40% decrease in workers' compensation costs and challenges. And at that bottom line, nearly a $6 saving for every $1 invested in employee well-being. So Shirley, I suppose from some of your clients that you've worked with, have you seen some of those results come through?
So before I do that, there's a couple of really interesting things in the chat. Jeff, do you mind if I just grab those? The first really good one was that Glenn has said, which is right, that a PCBU such a school has obligations, and others would probably include students. So that's a good thing for schools to remember. And then Muriel has just run a psychological safety in the workplace and found Work Australia's Code of Practice Managing psychological hazards very useful.
Mm.
So I'm just doing a shout out because I also found it useful. And if you're in Queensland, please remember Queensland's different from New South Wales.
Yeah.
So you look at theirs. And then somebody has asked, which is great for this slide, what's the difference between psychological safety and psychosocial safety? And so I just think that that's a good thing to insert here, which is that when we talk about psychosocial, there's two components of it. One is psycho and the other is social. And you made a really good point to me when we were practicing, which was that often one leads to the other. So social is around the impact of social. So it's like exclusion or being marginalized or not feeling included. And I might just ask you if you can think of an example of that, Jeff. Whereas the psychological is like the kind of impact on your well-being. But the really big thing that the people in the chat who are talking about running this like they do with physical risk, the really big thing is with psychosocial, you're not looking just at the impact. You're not looking at someone being damaged. You're actually looking at the risk, which is why those circles are so important. But
Yeah.
you had an example of a client where there was potentially a social issue.
Yeah, so this was actually, and it was actually something in our own organization a few years ago. I noticed that one member of our team was always reluctant to come along to any team activity that involved alcohol. So, going to the pub on a Friday afternoon or, drinks while bowling and those sort of things. And something just in the back of my mind said that I feel this person is just uncomfortable, perhaps around alcohol. Maybe they've had an alcohol problem in the past that they're dealing with, or that it's somewhat triggering, and they're not comfortable saying that, but they're just they're self-excluding from those social events. So we actually made a pivot and started, making sure we had a good mix of team activities that, were not anywhere near, a source of alcohol. So, we would, do something, away from a pub or, bowling or whatever it was that we did. And then that person started to come along. So Sheila's right. You think about, social as in how do we interact as humans? How do we come together, to do our work, to, away from work, etc. And what impact does that have on our mental well-being, our psychological state? And then to answer Catherine's question about where does psychological safety fit into that mix? Psychological safety is about being able to speak up and not have a negative consequence from that. So if you think about psychological safety, particularly in the work that we've done with Amy Edmondson from Harvard, it's really around that as leaders, as organizations, how are we creating the space that if someone does have if there is a psychosocial risk that we're not aware of, do they have the right channel to raise that, to speak up about that and not have a negative consequence? And Shirley's got some great sort of thinking and stuff that we'll talk about later on about how you might do that as an organization. So see them sort of married together, but psychological safety as the mechanisms and the channels to allow people to speak up about things that concern them about their mental, their psychosocial risks that might be happening.
Yeah, would you mind going to the next slide? Because you did ask me for a comment, but I think my comments are better. So I think this feeds really nicely into what you were saying about the interface. So when you're thinking in Australia, the rest of the world hasn't yet got all this legislation. They're watching to see what happens with us, I believe. But we have a whole buckets of legislation that have come in place in the last 3 years. We've had more change in the last 3 years than in the last 60 in Australia. So things that interface with what we're talking about is things like the right to disconnect, which is the right not to answer reasonably your employer after work. But can you see that if that's making you feel unsafe, or if you need dialogue about that, that feeds in. Respect at work, which is like a positive duty to eliminate sexual misconduct in the workplace. Sexual misconduct is both social, and psychological. Whistleblowing protections, which is things like wage anomalies and, things that are rotten in the state of Rome, that can often interface. We now have domestic violence leave, and we now have protections for things like menopause. We're not protecting you from menopause, unfortunately, for those of you on there. We're just allowing more conversations and flexibility around it. So why that's really important is because what you can see from that list of things, if I'm suffering from menopause, it's not always obvious. And putting extra pressure on me, or those workplace circles aren't obvious. And the other thing that's really interesting, that we often think about a big blow, like asking somebody to work 150 hours, but often really low levels over a long time can accumulate for psychological health. And we've really seen that all over the world from COVID. It's taken a long time for people's mental health to bounce back. And in many circumstances, psychological hazards will interact, and we call, so for example, if you're somebody who is diverse and you've had a really difficult background, then feeling excluded can actually have a much bigger impact, particularly if you're balancing your work, family, and everything else, and having a difficult time at home. So really that sets us up for the next piece.
Yeah. And I think it's a great point that you make around when we think about health and safety in general in organizations. The physical stuff, you can tell when an electrical cord needs replacing. You can tell when a ladder isn't safe, or there's those sort of things. But the psychological pieces, like I said, particularly those that are iterative, like accumulation of small steps, are very hard to detect as a leader, as an organization. So one of those sort of challenges is, how do you actually get people to surface some of those issues in a way that suits their process, their autonomy. And so it'd be sort of good to dive into those as we go. The first thing I want to do, and we'll have a quick poll just in a second, is about how do we actually prioritize as leaders, as organizations, the psychosocial well-being in our organization. So we've got our first poll that's just popped up. So we're talking about the spectrum of priority. So on the one end, you can say we just want to do enough to comply with legislation. That's it's a checkbox exercise. We need to do this because we need to comply. This middle ground is you want to do a bit more than is absolutely required according to a company strategy, or do you actually want to be up at that top end and be an employer of choice, and actually really see psychosocial well-being as a differentiator for your organization? So I'll just give you a couple of moments to think about your organization, where you're at today, and maybe that maybe today you're complying with legislation, but you want to become an employer of choice. So it'd be interesting to see, just where we sit as a group on that spectrum.
That's why people are doing that. Can I just call out the power? I want people to notice and feel the power of being able to answer this question with the data coming up in a de-identified way. Like I just want people to just focus on that for a second, because we often forget about the power of being able to answer the question and say, I just want to comply, without having to feel judged or think about the external eye on us. Because I think that's going to be really important to think about when we start talking about speak up and stuff.
Wonderful. Okay, let's look at those results. Thanks, Melody. Yeah, so there was those. So, about half of you are either at that point of being an employer of choice or know you need to be there. And a good 22% are at the point of complying with legislation. So again, quite a diverse mix, and we know, with everything that goes on, particularly post-COVID, a lot of companies are more leaner in their HR teams. So it's interesting to see this data, and maybe pop into the chat if you're comfortable to do so. If you're at that comply end of the level and you need to do better, what are you thinking about in terms of what you're starting to plan, or have you got any questions about how this might affect you? Heidi makes a really good point about diversity in terms of psychosocial safety in organizations, particularly in the Asia context. I work a lot with our clients across Asia, and I do think there's a particular challenge in thinking about the variety of different ways that people want to contribute. We do see that in Australia as well, but I think in Australia and New Zealand, clients have a few more systems in place to support how people contribute and speak up. But obviously, as you move across Asia and even global entities, where you've got lots of different languages and expectations about what does it mean to speak up, and not to stereotype. I hate sort of feeling like I'm stereotyping, but how someone from South Korea might prefer to speak up is going to be very different from someone from India or the US or other territories. So I think that's the work that I see to be done across Asia, is thinking more deliberately about variety of channels that people can speak up.
And Jeff, the other thing that I've found with our clients that can be really tricky is often you're a large international organization, but you might be in a pocket organization. So there might be 3 of you you might be part, and your HR manager might be in Singapore and you might be based in Manila or Sydney. And so really thinking about that, because often the mothership has great psychological safety, but it's much harder as you move out to the outer circles of the organization.
Yeah, wonderful. Muriel's organization's well on their way. Good to see. Okay, keep the comments coming. We'll move into some of the particular tactics and habits as we see them for creating a psychosocial environment. And we start off with this understanding that the risk is an invisible threat, particularly psychosocial hazards. It can be hard to identify except for the inside. So as particularly senior leaders, when you're looking across your organization, whether it's your employee engagement survey data and other things, it's really hard to see from that balcony view what's really going on for people. So we really want to work on the habits around how a team's safe to speak up from without repercussions. So making sure they understand that the organization is prioritizing, that we have the systems in place to support this. So the first habit is...
I was just going to do a quick example. I was going to just throw out a quick example of that just for people. So an example of this is somebody during COVID who reached out and said, look, our manager, and I'll talk more about the story later, but our manager is getting us to all meet in the pub from home in order to kind of plan activities. And my mom is, neurodivergent is very sensitive to COVID and has a whole lot of stuff that could kill her. So I feel like I can't go. Now, you can see that from the manager's perspective, organizing that looked like really good, clever team building. And the organization, it was invisible, but that was a really important physical and psychological threat or risk. So that's just a good example.
And you can see from that person's perspective of, if I speak up and have everyone change their plans, will I be ridiculed? If there's others that say you're overreacting, all of those sort of almost microaggressions from that person's point of view come into play.
Or being excluded, not being part of the main team.
or literally then just being excluded, and all the impacts that we know that come from that. So the first habit that we've been looking at in this mix is setting the stage. So establishing clarity around how important is psychosocial well-being and psychosocial safety for our organization, letting people know that you're wanting to hear what's going on. So, understanding that a lot of the issues are below the surface, but really constantly reminding people that it is important. It is something that you as an organization, as a leader, need people to speak up so you can help solve. So not necessarily, again, not a one-off. It's not something that you say, we've done our required training and my door is up, my office door is open if you have any problems. It's actually the constant reminder this is a priority for our organization. The second habit is around inviting participation, increasing engagement. So we know, particularly in terms of the psychosocial risks, we need to provide anonymity, choice, some autonomy in how people raise and deal with the challenges. But we want to make sure we're inviting participation, giving those platforms that people can speak up in a way that suits their needs at that time, knowing that situations evolve as we go. And the third big habit that we think about is, how do we as leaders, as organizations, respond thoughtfully and build trust in the process? So, how do we, make sure that when we go back, if someone, reports an issue, responding thoughtfully, making sure that you keep your word, if you've made certain promises, and feed back to that person what is happening. Make sure it's always at the level of anonymity that suits them at that time, and make sure that trust in the entire sequence of events is supported. Shirley, anything you want to add from the work that you do around these habits?
I think we're going to unpack some of that a little bit. I just thought, to be honest, that was perfect and succinct. I mean, I think there's somebody says in the chat, how do we actually start or set the stage? Most places where this is a challenge refused to acknowledge that this event exists. And I really wanted to say that I just think this is fabulous. Set the stage, invite participation, and respond thoughtfully. And this might cause a lot of chatter in your chat, but from where I sit, the fish swims from the head. And unless you've got a senior leadership team of people that care, there's just nothing you can really do. I mean, this has to be led by leaders who get it and care. So I'm really interested to hear if you've got a habit that you can enlist for someone who does care to ignite passion within a senior leadership team that might not.
Yeah, and this is where we are mindful about positioning this session today, and this might be the first webinar in a series of webinars we do around various topics on this. But really, as leaders, how do you start to shift the needle? We know Ramona makes a great point about there are some people that are just going to sweep this under the carpet and let's just push on. You can start to bring them online, and we've been doing a range of executive briefings around these topics to share some of the research around the cost of business and the cost to well-being and all of that comes into it. So it's not just a nice to have, it's actually a business imperative. I know, Shirley, you also do work with clients around getting them to better understand the legal obligations and how that all comes together. But yeah, I think start, like she said, start with some of your senior leaders. I would also start building a bit of a ground movement through your HR business partners and others, not necessarily directly talking about some of these topics, but just overcoming that inertia with small bits. Sorry, Shirley.
So Jeff, sorry, Alex put in the chat, does anyone use third-party platform to receive anonymous reports? And which is funny because that's what we're going to talk about in a minute. But we use, that's what Elka does, and it's either using the software or service. But ironically, for some of our clients where they have had leaders that are a bit dubious, like we've had a couple of clients where they've gone, we don't get any reports. We're really fabulous. We're accessible. There's nothing going on in our organization. We don't need training. We don't need coaching. We're good. And then we've gone, let's put in both an anonymous reporting system, and let's also put in addition, a contact point that's external from the organization, so people can report in either internally or to an external. And what's been really interesting in two of those organizations is that they've then suddenly got a huge number, not a huge number, like not like out of control, but like a significant number, like 10, 15 a week reports of things that people are concerned about. And what's been amazing is the HR BPs, the human resource business partners, have said, we all knew that that was out there, but we couldn't get it. But the minute that they can show that data to senior leaders, that's really moved the needle, because leaders have gone, oh, why doesn't anyone tell us that? And the answer is because you always think it's approachable when you're at the top. It's not that easy when you're not at the top.
Exactly.
So, but so moving.
So let's ask in the chat, and I'll try and catch up on any comments that we've missed. So what habits does your organization need to work on? So are you at that end of the spectrum where you need to set the stage? It's good to see a few organizations already using systems to help invite participation. So where are you at on that terms of the spectrum? So, are you at the setting the stage or even before, haven't even started sort of stage? Are you rolling through some systems and processes to gather that data, invite that participation? Or are you at the end where you've got a robust method for people to respond, report and respond with trust?
It was also good to see a whole lot of people were leading it with leadership training first, because I think that's also a really good way to do it.
And that's important. We know a lot, when we do our work around supporting people to ask for feedback, something that is also not directly a psychosocial risk, but if I'm comfortable asking for feedback, then it's a good sign that I'm in a healthy workplace. We often start with training leaders about how to respond to feedback. So, that respond thoughtfully piece is sometimes where we start some of our training, because we know that leaders need to be ready when someone speaks up to respond in a thoughtful, meaningful way to build that trust. Because if, someone speaks up and they get shot down, then the likelihood of them speaking up again is diminished.
And Jeff, there's quite a lot of stuff in the chat about surveys. Can I just say a few words against? I'm a lover of surveys, but I just think people confuse surveys with Speak Up, and I just want to separate those two things out. The difference is Speak Up is a platform and or a phone line and or accessibility to leaders, so that when something happens to me, I can choose to say something, or if I see something, I can say something. That's a good tagline. A survey comes around, and what that's there is to take temperature. And I think a lot of organizations confuse those things to their detriment for two reasons. One is you don't want individual issues in your temperature. I can be genuinely happy at work, but have an issue, and I should separate that out. And the second is, there's a lot. The second is sometimes there's pressure on me at the time that I answer. I might be in a good state or not a good state, and something might arise in between the two pulse surveys. So I think those are two different things. It's great to have pulse surveys, but pulse surveys are not Speak Up platforms.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say is, I also think that just because you've got a Speak Up platform, you also need policies and leadership. So it's three things: test the temperature, have the policies and leadership so people know what's there. And the third one is have a place for them to speak up safely.
Yeah. Right. Let's move on to our third bit. How do we support, and it's probably a good segue from what we're just talking about. How do we support our teams and people to speak up? So the first big challenge is around anonymity. So this is something that you work a lot in. One of the biggest insights I had in our discussions has been really thinking about the spectrum of anonymity. It's not a yes, no, it's not a not a one-off decision. It evolves over time. So what have you got to say about that?
So that was the thing that, so I was working at the court. The court borrowed me to run the industrial relations list one day a month to see if I could facilitate conversations between, employers and employees who were in front of the court and resolve them. And I did that. I was meant to do it for 6 months. I did it once a month for 6 years. So I did a lot of matters. And the thing that absolutely struck me is every time I bring the people in the room, I would just say to the applicant, why didn't you tell them sooner? Because I had a 97% success rate of resolving these issues without making a decision. Part of that was because I had a lot of power and people always respond to that. But a lot of that was because people would say to me, I had nowhere to take this. And I'd say to the employer, how come they had nowhere to take this? And they'd go, but we have open door policies. And I'd say to the employee, why didn't you walk through that open door? And the answer was always, how do I know what would happen or that it was safe? And so that employer that I told you about a few minutes ago, where the needle moved for the senior management, is because when they put in a tool that allowed it anonymity, 80% of people came in anonymously. But the tool has a two-way chat, which is really important, because if it comes in anonymously and there's nothing you can do about it, everyone's stuck. But what happened is when you had the two-way chat with people having EQ leadership training, so they knew how to respond, after a while, people would go, oh, I know what's going to happen. I know what they're going to do. Here's my name. So the good example is that person who spoke up about those meetings in the pub. She came in anonymously. The HR BP said to her, what about if we give your leader an award? We give him an award because we love what he's doing, but we say to him that he needs to move it into our staff room and we'll give catering. That's part of the reward that he gets. Would that be comfortable for you? And the young worker said, that's fine, because I'm happy to be with my colleagues. It's the greater public in the pub that's a problem. And once she knew that that was safe, she was happy to give her name and her leader's name and to therefore get the award. Have I frozen? Have I frozen? So I might keep talking just in case I'm there, and hopefully Jeff will come back. And if he doesn't, then I will put myself on a hotspot.
No, I think it was just my internet connection.
No, that's completely fine. I didn't know which one of us dropped. So that just gave everybody a 2-second think tank. So the big summary for me on that is, number one, an anonymous option is quite empowering. And number two, that remember that once people build a bit of trust, they might tell you who they are. Jeff, if you're there, can you take us to the next slide? So the next slide is, I think, also people saying, how do I do this? What about process? And I think that it's really about clarifying why. Why do we need you to speak up? What's it going to do? what's it going to do with it, clarify where, not 4,000 channels to come in, like choice, like you can phone us, you can come in through an open door, or here's an anonymous pathway. And the other thing is you need to actually make sure that people know, where is it going to go? What are the steps? What are your options? Support, advice, problem-solving pathways. And my pet bugbear, you'll love this, Jeff, my pet bugbear, please don't call it a grievance handling process, because I always say to people when they go, oh, can you have a look at my grievance handling process? I always go, hey, would you lodge a grievance? And people go, oh, no, I don't like to I don't like to whinge, or I don't like to complain. And I go, well, then don't call it a grievance handling process. Call it tell me anything. Call it have a conversation. Call it let's solve the problem together. Call it something that doesn't sound like you're making people whinge.
Yeah. And it's important. We talk a lot about getting people to speak up about the small things so they don't become the big things. So if you're waiting for people to become a whistleblower or lodge a grievance, you've already missed it. You've missed the mark. You need to be having people speak up about things that make them uncomfortable or things that they are not clear on. One of the areas in that psychosocial risk piece is around job clarity. I, as a leader, might write a job description for a team member and think I'm being very clear in what this job is about. But to the person doing the job, it may not be as clear. So I wholly agree. Speak up about anything. We want to process it all.
And I think that's really important. I had a situation this week, which is really interesting. I was in a meeting where, a team had decided on a course of action, and the senior manager came in and went in front of, external people, no, that's not what we want. That's not right. And in the same meeting, that same organization doesn't think that they need a speak up platform because they think that their leadership is incredibly accessible. But what was really interesting when you see that is that if those people do feel uncomfortable, they can't actually go to somebody external and go, hey, I'm really uncomfortable. Can you help me work through how I might raise this with the manager to have a problem-solving conversation? They've got nowhere to go. So with a situation like that, you risk losing really fabulous staff because they don't give you the opportunity to work it through.
Yeah. Faith Sun makes a really good point in the chat around anonymous is good for speaking up, but a tough task for the direct manager to act sometimes. So that might sort of lead us into, how do we respond and what's your view on, how do we manage the anonymity?
So I think there's a couple of things on that. The first thing with anonymity is when we put a platform in, allow people to go to various parts. But the first thing is just because you start anonymous doesn't mean you're going to stay anonymous. So the people who take the first contact need to be very well trained to listen in a very trauma-informed way. They also need to ensure that they understand what a reporter wants. And what I find a lot of the time is reporters often don't know what they want. So if you've got a really good, skilled front-facing contact, going to Faison's point, they will often say, this is something you need to raise with your manager. Can I help you? Either with a human coach or with an AI coach to practice what you might say or how you might raise it so it's constructive. And that's really about number 3, having options. Like we often think everything's got to be investigated or fixed or disciplined. But actually, it's about listening, asking, and then really trying to support people to solve it themselves and also get people really comfortable with coming in when they've spoken to their front-facing contact, feeling really confident and comfortable to name who they are so that support can be given to them easily. Yeah.
And I think it's good, like you say, that front-facing contact, the first person. Here at NLI, we have a group of mental health first aiders that play that role. Because again, we're not in terms of numbers, a big organization compared to some of our attendees
Nice.
today, and clients. But often that's just to give, because when you're in this situation, I just need to know what are my options. What are a couple of things that I may not have considered to think about. So that's how that first response could play a role of not necessarily being the person to solve the issue, but just give that perspective over, here's 3 ways you can do it. You can have maybe have a discussion with your manager, maybe have a discussion with, someone in HR, or, stay anonymous in this 2-way chat until, we get a bit more information.
And Jeff, there's a really good question from Megan, but also building on your point, we really widen the scope of options for a lot of people. So for instance, I am a great fan of a thing called conflict coaching, which is a facility where somebody can go for 3 sessions with a coach and work out why it's triggered them and what they can learn about that trigger and how they can overcome it. The other thing I'm a really big fan of, and it's a plug, but I'm really excited to use Niles, because the other thing I'm an incredible fan on is when I had this problem with the client, I actually used our internal AI, which is not as well trained as Niles, in order to ask it. I said, this is what I'm thinking of saying. Can you give me any feedback? And use it, the front page. I used that as a front-facing contact, right? And it was amazing because this artificial AI said, that was a great job, Shirley. And have you thought about the fact that you haven't given them a positive first up? You've just launched straight in. Here's a positive sentence you might want to use. So actually having conflict coaching, external mediators, and to Megan's point, with a lot of smaller clients, to introduce anonymous speak up platform, you need to wrap it in consultancy services. So sometimes you need to bring in a platform plus someone who's running the platform just for a period until that small organization has the competence to bring it internally. And that can sometimes take a year or so. So that's absolutely available.
Yep. And Claudia makes a great note about just general coach training for leaders. We've been doing this for more than 27 years, I think, now at NLI. Just making sure that, again, that's a way to get ahead of some of the problems. So if you've got leaders who are good at coaching and good at dealing with their teams, are probably going to be better at setting the stage, better at that, inviting participation. So if you're interested in some of, talking to us a bit more about coaching in general, just put the word coaching in the chat and we'll follow up with you. If you're interested in those habits that we talked about earlier, just put habits and we'll know to come back to you and have a deeper conversation around those. But just we're almost out of time for today. We could talk forever, Shirley, but just want to come back to the key themes we've been talking about today. So, firstly, deciding where do you actually sit? How is this a priority for your leaders and your organization? What are those habits that you want you and your teams to learn about, to support these aspects? And third, as Shirley spoke a lot about, very passionate about what are these simple systems for people to speak up, to give that transparency and anonymity together. So as we're up, any sort of closing comments from you, Shirley? Anything we didn't touch on that you want to say?
Look, I think what my closing comments was, there's a couple of things. Firstly, if anyone wants to explore, speak up platforms, I'm really happy for them to pop that in the chat as well. But my closing comments is, I think what's brilliant about a conversation between you and me and having people here is you need both the human systems, plus you need feedback data to support those human systems. And one of the things that software provides is if people are speaking up,
Mm.
at the back end, you've got de-identified tags of the kind of things they're bringing up, as you said early, which gives your leaders data to fine-tune what kind of training, whether it's habits or coaching, or whether they need Niles to sit with their front-facing contacts. It really gives the feedback as a loop. And for invisible risks, speak up, feedback, and data is critical.
Yeah, wonderful. And just before we get into a couple of announcements, I'll explain what Shirley's been talking about with Niles in a second. So we've just got a quick poll for those. Use the poll, use the chat. We'll collate all the data together. So what would you like us to follow up you with? Whether it is solutions for your organization, so that might be training in those habits with various programs. Do you think that you would need some individual development, whether it's doing a coaching program yourself or learning a bit more about how do you lead as a leader? I think in partnership with NLI, so that's the work that I do around culture change, around analyzing and looking at what you need in terms of shifting habits in your organization. And the final one, talking to Shirley more in depth to get a demo of the Speak Up software that they've developed. And just a note on that, if you select that you're okay with us passing your contact details to Shirley for follow-up. So we'll just leave that poll up for a couple more minutes as we just talk about a couple of announcements. So firstly, not too long before our next NeuroLeadership Summit, this will be fully virtual at the end of October there, including some sessions during the day for Asia Pacific timing. So we're just finalizing the program for that, but sign up if you want to learn out more about that. The next one, a bit of a QR code on there for those that might want to book a time with Shirley to follow up. They'll access her calendar. You can find a slot just to ask some further questions if you want to unpack any of those pieces, particularly around the Speak Up software and some of the work that she's done with clients. Melly's also dropped the link to that in the chat, and we'll include in the follow-up email if you don't get a chance to grab that. The next one is Lead. So this is a new program we just launched this year, fully online. As open enrollment is available. So it covers a lot of the research that we've done over the years for what makes a good leader, for building relationships, for making impact, and retaining good people. So click the QR code through there if you want to find out more about Lead. We have an ongoing open enrollment available for that, or we can do a cohort for your organization if that's what you're interested in. In terms of personal development, we've got a couple of our brain-based coach conversation skills programs coming up, including one we've just announced for February next year here in Sydney. Find out more through the QR there. And as Shirley's been talking a lot about Niles, we're a big fan of Niles. So Niles is our neuro-intelligent leadership enhancement system, an AI chatbot that we've fed all of our research, our 25 plus years worth of research and writing and know-how and IP. So you can license this and talk to us about how Niles might be able to come to your organization to really give that support to your leaders, to ask questions, how to run better meetings, or if you've got a particular conflict with a team member, or all of those sort of challenges. Niles can be your help to find a quick answer through that. So really exciting. Put Niles in the chat if you're interested to learn more about them.
So, Jeff, before you go to the last one, I just thought I'd ask you if you had any closing comments, because having had to do all the announcements, you might not get that space.
Thank you. My ongoing insight around this work is how front of mind it has to be for you as an individual, as a leader, and as an organization. We know it, in some organizations, some of these potentially toxic challenges are hard to overcome. But consistent small steps is what makes it work. And I'm really proud that the Australian context is sort of leading the way in terms of looking at this from a legislative regulatory lens. And hopefully other jurisdictions either follow through or organizations get better ahead of it, so it doesn't have to be legislated. Because the business data speaks for itself in terms of the financial cost to organizations when you're not supporting the mental health and well-being of your people and customers. So thank you. We're right on time. Thank you for all your amazing comments. Please connect with us if we didn't answer your question. And like I said, we're also having a series of roundtables over the coming months in different cities. So Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Canberra at this stage. If you're interested in joining us for a small group discussion in person, just put roundtable in the chat. Otherwise, we'll include that information in a follow-up email. So really looking to dive deeper into aspects of this in some of those in-person sessions. But thank you, and thank you, Shirley, for your collaboration and your time. Always appreciated and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. That was great fun.